Shalom and welcome. Have we got a program for you? An unbelievable program, my friends. The theme is, the topic is, was Christopher Columbus Jewish? Can you imagine that? And tonight, to talk about Christopher Columbus and the Inquisition and Spain and the background is Albert Harary. Albert Harary is a community leader. He was a business executive, very popular person in the community. He's a retired public utility vice president, former executive director of the Alzheimer's Association, and his interest has led him to do research in the lives of many famous people, such as Emma Lazarus of the Statue of Liberty fame, Israel's War for Independence hero Mickey Marcus, and British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. Hopefully we'll get Al back to talk about some of these other topics. He's going to discuss evidence that has led a number of scholars to believe that Christopher Columbus came from a Jewish family. I also want to add that Al is a Hamden notable. He's a member of the Jewish Historical Society, past president, member of the Ethnic Board of Directors, former president of Temple Beth Sholem, and he's now president of the Friends of the Hamden Library. Al, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Nice to be here with you.
Thank you. And it's so good that you're able to take time from a busy schedule to be here.
My pleasure.
Before we get into whether Columbus was or was not Jewish, can you tell us briefly the history of the Jews of Spain? When did they first arrive here?
Many people think that after the destruction of the Second Temple, that the Jews fled to Spain. But actually, they were in Spain long before that. In fact, Paul in the Christian Bible talks about the Spanish Jews and getting to them and getting them to follow Jesus. So they were there long before the Second Temple was destroyed.
Okay. The Muslims, or the Moors, as they're referred to, and Christians, both played a role in Spain before Columbus came upon the scene. Can you fill us in a little about Jewish life under the Moors?
Sure. In the year 711 CE, the Moors invaded Spain and conquered the southern part of Spain. So there was the northern part where the Christians were, the southern part where the Moors were. And under the Moors, it's called the Golden Age for Jews, because the Jews were in science, in philosophy, they were physicians to the king, and even had religious freedom. They had their own judicial courts under the Moors. And in fact, one of the greatest Jewish scholars, Moses ben Maimon, otherwise known as Maimonides, was born in Spain in 1135.
Now, so you're telling us that under the Moors, the Jews, by and large, were well treated.
They were treated very well.
And they were able to practice their religion.
Yes.
And then, of course, later on, when the Christians won out over the Moors, Spain became totally dominated by the Christians. Now, the question is, how did this affect the Jews?
Well, in a nutshell, the Jews' lives became much worse. In the late 1300s, in Castile and Aragon, which were two major cities in Spain, the Christians began to convert the Jews. And those Jews who would not convert were exiled from Spain, thrown out.
Or burned at the stake?
Yes, in some cases. And that was in the 1300s. We tend to think of the Inquisition as starting around the 1400s, but actually this was in the 1300s that this was going on. And there was escalating anti-Semitism, and it's estimated that 100,000 Jews converted to Christianity during that time. Those Jews who converted and actually practiced Christianity were called conversos. Those Jews that converted but secretly practiced Judaism were called Marranos, or pigs, or swine. So that's the designation that we have to keep in mind as we go on talking toward Columbus's entry.
You know, it's interesting. I read that many leading Christian families in Spain today, like for example on Friday night, the women will light candles.
Yes.
And they have certain traditions that have been passed on from mother to daughter, mother to daughter, over the few hundred years. You want to comment about that?
When asked why they do it, they don't know. It's just been a custom in their families. I know someone personally who lived next door to someone who was lighting the candles. And he asked her, why are you lighting candles? And she said, I don't know, but my mother did, my grandmother did, and it's gone back as far as I can remember.
So in other words, these people might have been descendants of the conversos.
That's right, and they would be the Marranos.
And the Marranos.
Yes.
Where they secretly...
in public they were conversos, and in private they practiced Judaism.
That is so interesting.
It is.
So today, probably so many Spanish families have Jewish ancestry.
That's true.
And Jewish roots.
Absolutely right.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Of course, when we study Columbus in school, we hear about Ferdinand and Isabella. King Ferdinand, Queen Isabella.
Yes.
And how did their marriage affect the Jews?
Isabella was the Queen of Castile, and Ferdinand was the King of Aragon. Those were two major power centers. So when they were married in 1469, that basically sealed Spain to be totally dominated by the Christians. It's funny how Hollywood has shown the Spanish people in such glorious light. I remember a movie with Tyrone Power called Captain from Castile.
Oh, I remember.
You remember that?
Yes.
So, and again, showed them as heroic and so forth, but to the Jews they weren't so heroic. And I'll tell you a little bit about it. As Isabella and Ferdinand were sort of not coerced necessarily, but pressured by the Catholic Church to that the conversos were heretics, and that really they should get rid of them. You know, even the conversos that practiced Christianity, they were suspect. But besides that, they didn't do anything about it at that time. But they even had conversos working for them. In one case, it was Don Abraham Senior, who was the chief of Castile in terms of collecting taxes. He was the tax collector for Castile, and he was a converso. Yes. So they treated them in some ways well. They didn't start to do anything against them until a little bit later on.
And wasn't there another important court figure who was either Marrano or a converso?
Oh, there were a number of them, and I'm going to talk about them later on.
Oh, okay, fine. You mentioned earlier about the Inquisition. You want to tell us, to our viewing audience, what was the Inquisition?
Well,
and what horrible things did they do?
Okay. We remember that in the 1300s, they were doing horrible things. We didn't call it Inquisition, but it was essentially something like that. But now we're into the 1400s, and in 1483, Ferdinand and Isabella appointed Torquemada as the Inquisitor General. And we all hear about Torquemada and such horrible thoughts we have about him. Well, the main goal of the Inquisition was to destroy Jewry, to make sure that Spain was totally Catholic and there were no more Jews. They were somehow gone.
No more Moors too, right?
Well, yes, the Moors they were kicked them out, but they were actually fighting with the Moors. The Jews weren't fighting with anyone. They were just trying to live. The Moors were actually an army that had to be destroyed. And then the rest of the Moors who were left had to be gotten rid of, just like the Jews were. Absolutely right. But we don't really talk too much about the Moors here, about the Inquisition that they had. But they had one too. So in less than 12 years, from 1483 to 1492, the Inquisition condemned at least 13,000 Marranos, men and women, and these are people who converted but were suspected of practicing Judaism in secret. Whether a neighbor turned them in, or whether it didn't have to be true necessarily. But if, let's say, you're on the outs with a neighbor would go to the authorities and say they're practicing Judaism, and they would get you, and they were either tortured or they were burned alive. We're talking about 13,000 men and women.
Horrible.
Yes.
It was another Holocaust.
But interestingly, that the property of these people was split between the Pope and the King and Queen.
Oh.
Yes, interesting.
That is interesting.
Now let me get back to this for 1 second. Sure. Before we. Never mind. Go ahead.
Okay. I believe the Jews were ordered to leave Spain in 1492.
Yes.
And if I'm not mistaken, they left on Tisha B'Av.
Yeah, we'll get into that.
Okay. You want to tell us about them leaving?
Yes.
Before you do, I want to point out to my viewing audience, I'm interviewing Al Harary, a community leader and a business executive, and he hasn't gotten into was Columbus Jewish yet. He's giving us the background of what happened in Spain leading up to Columbus and the Inquisition and what happened to the Jews.
I think the background is important for getting to whether Columbus was Jewish, because certain things will happen that really depended on what the Inquisition and the treatment of Jews that affected Columbus. And we're going to get into that a little bit later on. But talking about the Jews being ordered to leave Spain, in 1492, the King and Queen prepared two documents. The one document was a decree that ordered the Jews to leave Spain, period. No ifs, ands, or buts, the Jews had to leave. So between 150,000 and 300,000 Jews managed to leave Spain by August 2nd of that year. And in fact, my family was among them, because I'm Sephardic, and my family left Spain
Harary
at the same time. So we date back to then. Now, that date, as Barry mentioned, was in the Hebrew calendar, was the 9th of Av. That's a month in the Jewish calendar. And it's known as Tisha B'Av in the calendar. Now, we should know again, just as it happened before, that the expulsion of the Jews, and that's, let's say, anywhere between 150 to 300,000, had property, and that property was split and given to the King and Queen, and the church took some of it too. So besides the religious aspects of this, we know there's an economic aspect to it that sometimes is overlooked.
Yeah, I'm going to interrupt you for a minute.
Yeah.
History has shown that since the Jews were expelled from Spain, Spain became a second or third rate power.
Yes.
Where it had been a superpower in the world.
That's right.
And the Jews were the backbone of the economy, of the culture, the life, and so on.
That's right.
And enriched Spanish life.
Absolutely.
And after they expelled the Jews, things went downhill.
That's true. Absolutely right. Now, there was a second document that was issued by Ferdinand and Isabella, and that document was called the Capitulations of Santa Fe, which most people don't know anything about. But that was signed on April 17th, and it designated Columbus as the governor of any lands that he discovered. So Columbus had let's say, another motive for going out, because wherever he was, he would be in charge, wherever he discovered. So Columbus left on his voyage on August 3rd. Don't forget, the last Jew left Spain on August 2nd, Tisha B'Av, and he sailed on August 3rd, even though his ship was ready and could have sailed on August 2nd.